Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. Alrighty, so in today's episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, we're going to be talking all about sulfur. So without further ado, let's get right into it.
Thank you, Dylan. Immediately, when I think of sulfur, I think of the nutrient that most people forget to put on. And when you look at a fertilizer analysis, you'll see nitrogen's first, phosphates second, potassium third, and sulfur fourth. So if you use that frame of mind on the analysis of a fertilizer, it's telling you that sulfur is the fourth most important nutrient of the nutrient that crops need. So saying that, we need to know a lot about sulfur and why we need to apply it and when we need to apply it and what are its properties that make it different from the NPKs that we are used to applying. So first, we'll start with sulfur. It's a very stable compound. If it's in the elemental form, it's just sulfur. And it's somewhat, it's a non-metallic type mineral and anionic in its nature. And what I mean by that is once it's applied to the soil, it's going to want to form, it doesn't want to stay just in the elemental form because it'll be reacted upon and oxidized in the soil to forms of sulfur dioxide and then finally sulfate sulfur. So when we talk about sulfate sulfur, one, that's the form that plants can utilize. They can pick up through the roots and utilize for their functions in the plant. The rest of the forms are really not what are going to be available to the plant. It's what they can use. So, having said that, a lot of people look at it and wonder why I talk so much and highly about sulfur and why it's usually forgotten in the fertility program. But it's really necessary for the formation of proteins. So if you're growing a wheat or a corn, that protein is what you're trying to grow for the livestock to consume or for the bread that you're going to make to get a high protein source. And with that in mind, sulfur is essential for the formation of protein. Also, it's a component of vitamins like thiamine and also like glutathione and also biotin. And so it has a lot of essential needs. And the other thing that is really good about it is it makes your nitrogen about 10% more efficient in the uptake into the plant. Also, sulfur, because it's such a strong anion, can be used in soil amending. And what I mean by soil amending is taking cations off that soil colloid. We talked earlier about calcium and magnesium and strong cations that they are. Well, this is that strong anion that can go and remove those and actually pull those off the soil colloid with its double negative attraction. We talked about calcium and magnesium of having double positive, meaning have a really strong attraction of that negatively charged soil colloid. Well, the negatively charged sulfate, sulfur, is repelled from the soil colloid, but at the same time can attract calcium, magnesium. So sulfate, and one of the things that people use for soil amending, gypsum, is really heavily concentrated with sulfate sulfur. It's a calcium sulfate product, and it's 17% sulfur. So when you're putting on a ton of gypsum, you're actually applying 340 pounds of sulfate sulfur, which means it can have a good effect on soil amending if that's the product that is best for your soil. You can also amend soils by using elemental sulfur, because when you apply it to soil, there's a couple of bacteria that work on it and oxidize it, first to sulfur dioxide, SO2, and then to sulfate, SO4. And in that conversion, it's basically taking water with the activity of that biology and releases hydrogen, acidic hydrogen, back into the soil so that it can help in acidifying and getting some of these stronger cations out of the way. The other thing about sulfur because it is an anion, and one of the things that we really sometimes forget is that since it's not strongly held on anything, it'll find a cation, but it then will move down through the soil. So it will literally leach because there's no attraction to keep it on the clay of the soil. So when you say that, one of the things you need to remember is if it's moving out, say I apply it pre-winter and I get a heavy rainfall, there's a good chance that when I start to spring, I don't have any sulfur left. If your soil is good, has good soil structure, and water moves through freely, it will be pulling most of that sulfate sulfur out. So you'll be starting the year with hardly any sulfur at all. And then as you go through the year with irrigation, whether it's with flood irrigation, pivots, micro sprinklers, doesn't make any difference. Drip, whatever irrigation system you have, it will continue to leach sulfur out. So even if you apply it again in the spring, by the end of the year, it will probably be out again. And so what you need to do is form a program of applying sulfur throughout the year so that you can keep it at a level that's comfortable in the soil. And the number I like is about 100 pounds per acre or 50 parts per million.
Now Bill's going to explain why you actually need sulfur for your crops.
But what do you need sulfur for? And people always ask me, well, what's sulfur do for me? I talked a little bit. You need it to make protein, whether it's in a human diet, whether it's in a livestock diet, or whether it's in a crop's diet. We need those proteins for our biological functions. Okay, next, we need it to manufacture chlorophyll. Well, we know that the plant's basic, where it does photosynthesis, is in the chloroblast, and because of that, that's where we need chlorophyll. It also is needed to fabricate certain enzymes, which are needed, for plant processes. So, no sulfur, don't make the proper amount of enzymes, the engine of that plant doesn't work right. We don't think of plants as needing vitamins, but they do need vitamins just like any living thing. And sulfur is one that really helps in a lot of, I talked about thiamine, but it also is necessary for some other vitamins also.
Now Bill's going to talk about where you can actually get sulfur from.
So we want to go back now, and you say, well, okay, sulfur. Where can I get sulfur? Well, sulfur is in basically a lot of different compounds. You can use what we call triple mixes, like triple 12 and triple 15 and a 12-8-16 or a 21-7-14 on any combination of those. And what it is that if you'll look at that analysis and find that fourth number, that'll tell you how many pounds per 100 pounds you can find of sulfur in that triple mix. If you don't see anything there and they immediately go to calcium or magnesium, you know that there is no sulfur in that product. And there are products that are put together with no sulfur in them. Things that you might use for sulfur that you might be applying for the nitrogen first would be something like an ammonium sulfate, which is 24% sulfur and 21% nitrogen. And that's a really good source, particularly early on. And as you heard in the nitrogen presentation, you'll find that it's a really good basic building fertilizer for first thing in the year. You've got things like a potassium thiosulfate, a liquid, and it's 17% sulfur also. And it supplies both potassium and sulfate, and it's very convenient in its application since it's a nice clear liquid. One of the things I would warn you about on potassium thiosulfate is you can apply too much, and at one point it can actually get into some toxicity. So I would always say it's part of your supplemental potassium, but don't try to use it as your sole source. We then also have sulfate of potash, which is what a lot of people, they get their potash and they're putting sulfate of potash. So a lot of times they're getting sulfur by accident, the way I say it. Like I say, it's a 17% sulfur, so it's got a pretty good whack of sulfur. So if you're putting 200 or 300 pounds, you're getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 to 400 pounds of sulfate sulfur. If you are looking at doing some amending in the form of we don't really need any of the other nutrients, but we do want to make some corrections to pH, or we want to make some corrections to utilize sulfur to remove cations that are stubborn to move off the soil colloid. So we can use that elemental sulfur. And most of the elemental sulfur that we're using these days is a 90% sulfur. So every 100 pounds, you're getting 90 pounds of elemental sulfur. And usually it's caked with a bentonite clay of some time so that it will, one, not ball up and go together. Other thing, it reduces the flammability of sulfur, as sulfur can burn under the proper conditions. So you prevent that. And it's a nice mixable little pastille, as they call them, a little pellet that'll mix in with a blended fertilizer. A really good product to put into your program if you can get there. There's also, not used a lot, but there's an ammonium thiosulfate, kind of the partner of potassium thiosulfate, but it contains more sulfur in a tune of about 26%. So these are all great sources of sulfur. You can also find sulfur in other products. Some of the, what we like to say down in the more carbon-based products like manures. Also, you can have compost. You have all of these types of products, and they can have a fair amount of sulfur in them depending on what they were made with. You know, the components that you use to make that compost, the feed that was put in to the animals to get that manure, all show up the excesses in the manure or in that compost. So you can have a reasonable amount of sulfur in those composts, and they are nice in one regard in that they're slower to be released. Now, with every product, there is a value, and there's a value to get it to the proper level, which is what I told you. You can see a lot of benefit from keeping that sulfur up around that 50 parts per million range, or 100 pounds per acre of sulfate sulfur.
Now Bill's going to talk about what happens when you have too much sulfur.
But with everything, you can have too much. And when you have too much, some of the things that can happen are, we talked about elemental sulfur as acidifying the soil. You know, sulfate sulfur has since it's already been changed from sulfate to its oxidized state of sulfate, doesn't really have any effect on acidity of pH. So, but if you're using lots and lots of elemental, and I've seen a lot of people really pour it on because they think I have a high pH and I want to change it, so I'm going to put on a lot of soil sulfur or disintegrating sulfur, you know, like in the elemental form. And if you get too much, you can over-acidify these soils. And the other thing you can do is you can damage your soil structure. And you can do that by over-acidifying, releasing calcium, and all of a sudden you've got too much magnesium. Before you know it, you've worked hard to get your soil structure, but now you're just trying to chase a pH of 6.5 or something like that, and you end up damaging your soil. And so you can then change the cation balance that you're trying to get to. That's 68% calcium and 12% magnesium. All of a sudden, now you're down to 60% calcium and you're 20% magnesium. And it just goes on and on. So there's a point where you need to stop, which is another really good point to make, is that's why you don't slug it on and pull it all on at one time. You're feeding it out throughout the year because, one, it's going to leach to a certain point, and the other one is that the plant's going to be needing to pick it up all year. So if you go out and do a lot of amending with an elemental sulfur in the late fall, it has all winter to change your soil structure and actually do you some damage. Once you begin to change your soil structure and your cation balance, guess what? It's going to reduce nutrient uptake efficiency. You're not going to be in the proper air-water mixture in that soil, that perfect structure that we are trying to get to, and therefore, all of a sudden, your nutrient uptake is not as efficient. Meaning, most of the time, you have to apply more of that product to get the same amount into the plant. Remember, it's not how much you put on, it's how much gets into the plant. So if you put on 200 pounds of nitrogen and you get 180 or 190 in, you did really well. But if you put on 100 pounds of nitrogen and you only got 50 pounds in, that means I have to put another 100 pounds of nitrogen and hope I get 50 pounds out of that one to be anywhere close to where I had from that really good efficiency that we get through good soil structure and good cation balance. Another thing it does is it it causes molybdenum deficiency if it gets in too much excess. And molybdenum's a very, very, I call it a micronutrient, meaning it needs to be in very low volume. Usually, if you have 1 part per million in your soil, you have enough for your needs pretty much most of the time, the rest of the time that you're farming that soil. But molybdenum, and I'll just talk about one little thing about it, is that it helps in the assimilation of nitrogen into plant tissue. So when you are low, guess what? Now we've prevented molybdenum from being taken up, blocked it. And so what happens then is that we don't get as good of assimilation of nitrogen, and there goes our efficiency. So they kind of go hand in hand with our nutrient efficiency. I talk about it as being the 4th most important element after nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And in terms of what the plant needs for its function, that is where it falls. But don't forget calcium and magnesium, because we cannot get the best efficiency out of the other nutrients if we don't have good soil structure, and that's where calcium and magnesium. I hesitate to say they're the 5th and 6th most important, because all the rest of these nutrients above them are not nearly as efficient if you don't have calcium and magnesium. But having said that, the plants actually use more sulfur by volume than they do on calcium and magnesium. So that means actually more pounds of sulfur are needed for plant function and proper plant growth, production, all of the things that we're looking for, than calcium and magnesium. But if we don't have calcium and magnesium in the proper balance in the soil, the benefits of sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium all go down. The biggest difference between it and those other 3 above it, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in terms of significance, is it's an anion, and it's a leachable anion. Phosphorus, as we talked about, is also an anion. However, it is such a strong anion that ties up with calcium and magnesium and other cations in that upper part of the soil. It's not very leachable because it's held so tightly because of its structure. But sulfur, not as much. And so because of that, it will leach. And so it needs to be part of every season's fertility program.
Now Bill's going to talk about sulfur and its relation to pH.
I've had many people over the years try to fix their pH with sulfur. And I caution you, remember just the overall bulk of soil. For just that top 6 3/4 inches, we're looking at 2 million pounds. 2 million pounds. So you're going to change a pH that's upwards of 8 or 8.5 and trying to move it down to 6.5, and you're trying to do it with 300 pounds, 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds. Well, think about a ton in 2 million pounds. It's not a significant amount to have a super large effect on pH. Something that has a much greater effect on pH is your water. Because if your water is, we'll just take a number, is a pH of 8, and you're putting on about 3 acre-feet, 36 inches of water per year, that's equivalent of almost 1 million gallons or roughly 8 million pounds. And you're trying to change your pH with 2,000 pounds of a soil sulfur. Does it have an effect? Yes, it does. But does it have the effect that you're trying to achieve, which is getting your cation balance? Probably not. So it's one of the things that when people just focus in on one piece of fertility, pH, and that's all we worry about, you miss the greater details of what causes pH. And can I have a direct effect on pH? I cannot not aerate. I have to have water. And what if my water is all at rainfall and that rainfall is acidic? But I need sulfur. So do I put on sulfur that makes more acidity, like an elemental? Or do I use something that's already oxidized, like sulfate sulfur? The better use of sulfur in that case is put it in the oxidized form of sulfate. Because then, one, it's already plant available, and two, it's not going to acidify any further. Now, when you're utilizing your irrigation water at a high pH, maybe that's a point when you do want a little more acidification. So you have an opportunity to get some acidity around the rhizosphere of the roots and help your nutrient uptake. It's such an important tool in our toolbox and this is why I'm taking a good amount of time to talk about sulfur. We kind of throw it in other products we use, and we kind of forget about it. But it's
Now Bill's going to talk about how you can actually use sulfur to balance your soil.
probably one of the most important tools in soil balancing. If you have high levels of calcium or high levels of magnesium, or you have high levels of both, and you just have most of your base saturation tied up with calcium and magnesium, we just want to keep our calcium where it's at and drive the magnesium down. Well, for calcium or magnesium, it takes 2 pounds of sulfur to remove a pound of either magnesium or calcium. And so knowing that it takes a lot of sulfur to really do some amending. But there's a lot of other anions, and they don't have near the effect because they don't have the strong anionic double negative situation so that they can pull actual cations off that soil colony. One thing I want to make sure, if I don't hone in on anything else on this topic this time, it's got to be added to your fertility program every year. And the reason is that it leaches. But it's also, as I hope I've explained to you, it is very much something that is necessary for so many plant functions, and it helps in so many other ways. Everybody looks at it and they don't really see the value of sulfur. I know a lot of times I've seen people go out and say, my plants are yellow, so they need nitrogen. Everybody equates a yellowing or yellow color to lack of nitrogen, when in effect a lot of times it is not nitrogen, but it's sulfur. Sulfur has a lot of similarities to nitrogen in how it'll make a plant look when it is sulfate deficient or sulfur deficient. With that in mind, how do we know that? We don't know that unless we've taken a proper soil test to know where we started the season, know how much we've added, and when we've added that product to be able to produce the proper results that we're looking for in the field. I'd like to think that I've convinced you how important soil is in this topic today. But so many times we get tied up into ease of application. And one of the things about particularly permanent crops, or even now when we're looking at pivots, we normally have a hard time finding a product that fits our sulfur needs. Whereas with nitrogen, it's a really easy fix with ammonium sulfate. You know, we get a lot of sulfur and we need the nitrogen, and we broadcast that, and we get an uptake of sulfur that's just, it's satisfactory for the plant needs, and it's there, and it's something that makes it easy. However, can't really inject ammonium sulfate. I've seen some ammonium sulfate solutions, but they're hard to find, and normally, but they have about half, 11-12% sulfur is all they have, and about the same 10%, 11% nitrogen. So we have to put a whole lot of volume on. With cost of transportation, it's a whole lot easier to bring out something like a UN32 that has 32% nitrogen, and we're able to put our nitrogen on with a much more concentrated form of nitrogen, and we forget about sulfur. You can see we'd have to put on 2.5 to 3 times as much ammonium sulfate solution to be able to get enough nitrogen. And we don't get the benefit of having more than one form of nitrogen when we apply ammonium sulfate. So it has its fit, but an irrigation system has kind of lost favor, which I think is one reason we see a lot of sulfur deficient crops and get a lot of boost in production as soon as we start to change their sulfur applications so that they're spread out, and try to keep in that 50 parts per million to 100 pounds per acre area in that top 6-7 inches, where you'll have the best efficiency of almost all your nutrients, but particularly nitrogen. So as I close today on today's podcast, I just want to summarize. I wanted to make sure that I put enough value to sulfur in your fertility program. It really is vital for plant nutrition. It should be added every year, but check your sources. You might be adding it from a source that you don't even know. If you've got compost or manures or make sure that you keep abreast of how much of those the sulfur that could be in those products. In addition to a really important plant nutrient, it also is really important in soil amending, and it's really the biggest tool to counterbalance the cations that you have in excess in your soil. So sulfur becomes that tool that can move those big cations, whereas most of the other ones cannot. So I'd hope that you find this interesting today, and if you're not using sulfur in your program, start looking into it immediately. I think you'll find a big benefit to your production and to your plant health, and if it's a permanent crop, your long-term health of that plant. Sulfur at 50 parts per million will give you a larger canopy and a larger trunk diameter. It has a lot to do with getting those nutrients in easily and at the right rates. It's just a valuable nutrient. Thank you again today for listening. This is Bill Brush.
Thank you, Bill, for another really good episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell. I hope you all enjoyed listening to what Bill had to say about sulfur and its many different uses and its large importance to your crop. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for up and coming episodes. And last but not least, stay curious.